You're listening to RevOps FM with Justin Norris. Now, this may seem totally wacky to anyone born after 1990 or so, but one of the main benefits of marketing automation in the early days was to liberate marketers from a dependence on IT. So the vision there was that marketers could create their own emails and landing pages, make complex campaigns, do all the cool stuff they wanted to do, and they didn't need to know any code to do it. Did that actually happen? I think sure it did to some extent, but we also saw a few other things in trying to do that. We saw forms that were breaking, we saw systems that weren't scaling, integrations that failed, and just a lot of different requirements that couldn't be met by the way platforms worked out of the box. So that brought us back to step one, which is that we still needed developers, but we needed a special kind, someone who had the technical skills, but also a deep knowledge of the marketing domain. So effectively a MarTech developer. And for my money, today's guest is the best MarTech developer there is. He's a legend in the Marketo community, one of the smartest folks I know, and a good friend. Sanford Whiteman, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Justin. I was afraid that had something to do with me.
So, Sandy, we've known each other 8-9 years, getting dangerously close to 10 years at any event. And it's weird that I've never really asked you too much before about your background. Could you just walk us through how you got from point A to point B?
Yeah, sure. I used to be an IT person. I mean, I was a security and firewall person. I was the hard-ass Cisco guy who wouldn't let any ports through the firewall, even if supposedly some mission-critical app demanded it. I was paranoid about, I still am, of course. I bring all of this experience to the table, but I try to not be like that anymore. Nevertheless, I did have that background first. That got boring and stressful simultaneously, as a lot of people will tell you about working in security. You know, you're always thinking that your phone, let's call it, or pager, or whatever you have at the time is you're thinking I missed something, and any call you get, you know how it is in our world now. But anyway, that was like a nerve-wracking thing. And I started working with a friend on web app stuff, and we built this ridiculous app that still exists. I hope nobody hears me say ridiculous, but it's great. It still runs. It's still used by people in the textbook publishing industry of all the weird niche industries. A notoriously slow to digitize world where our app built, I cannot tell you how many years ago. It would be embarrassing. Like my lips can't form the number of years ago that it was built, nor the number of years ago that it last had a version upgrade. But it's still the best one out there. But that got a little bit weird because we couldn't find any more clients for it. We had conquered the few enterprises. I don't want you to think it makes a lot of money, but it's just like we had covered every large publisher because there's so much consolidation. And yeah, somewhere in there, my partner started working for a financial services company. And after a few years there, he brought me in to look at their MarTech stack. It's because he knew that I knew web stuff. So my first experience with Marketo, my first experience was troubleshooting Munchkin.
I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's episode, Knack. You know, I love marketing automation software, but let's be honest, the email and landing page builders are usually terrible. You can't make it nice without a developer, and marketers are going to find a way to break things or go off brand. You do not have time for that. So Knack is totally different. You set the guidelines and then give your users a building experience that's slick, modern, and beautiful. When they're done, everything goes to your map at the push of a button. And don't worry, it supports global teams, approval workflows. It's got your integrations. So head on over to revops.fm/knack. That's KNAK, and get a special offer just for my listeners.
I had used Salesforce or other sales CRM type stuff, but I had never used a marketing platform before. But their Munchkin wasn't working. It wasn't associating leads from clicked emails, the classic thing it's supposed to do. So I took this weird route in where I was brought in not as the reluctant, you get the web team and they hate to work with marketing and there's all that kind of resistance to doing, but it was like, you have to solve this. This is your job. Undistracted. So I kind of, I don't want to say reverse engineered, but figured out a lot of things about the tech side of Marketo first before doing anything else. And the form side, like you said, seeing that there's this open, adaptable, customizable thing. This was still like Forms 1.0 days, but I could tell this is a thing where there's no MarTech developer. There was no such thing. I might have been one of the few people in the world at that time that just was allowed to only do MarTech development, but it was only because, big shout out to my friend Brian, if he ever hears this, he brought me in and he said, give this person this project and this project only. And from there, of course, I got Marketo admin access and then there was a while that people assumed that I knew how to use the Marketo UI, smart lists and smart campaigns and flows. And I kind of didn't. I knew how to use the API and I was answering any question anybody had about that I could answer, right? But it took me a few years to then become the person that most of us are, with a fluency on the back end. And so since then, I've been trying to be to retain the mastery, of the tech side and the back end campaign side, which is hard because you can go down a rabbit hole of troubleshooting some tech thing, and that takes hours or days that other people are using in the UI itself. But anyway, so that's kind of the arc. And now, luckily, there's enough little problems to solve all over the place that's what I do.
So to zoom in on that first experience where you were essentially, sounds like locked in a room and said, don't come out until you fix Munchkin. I mean, the fact that you were given that opportunity is one unique thing. But then I think a lot of developers would maybe get it done and move on. And somehow you sort of like to take something apart, understand all the component pieces, appreciate it, and know how to put it back together again. And you didn't dismiss it as like, it's just this crummy little marketing script.
Right.
I'm kind of above that. Somehow you really saw something to make you go deep into that and got interested in it. And I'm just curious, where does that come from? Is that a you thing, or did you perceive, actually, I could really get good at this and then nobody else is doing it? Like, did you think of it that way, or was it just, this is interesting, I'm here, let's figure it out?
I don't deny that there's a motivation, an unconscious motivation of probably no one else knows how to do this. But I don't think of that like, from a career standpoint, more of a, I want to be the one who knows it. But I'm not even thinking that. I'm just like, I'm feeling it. Before I did the Marketo stuff, there was one other thing that I was like super expert weirdo in. And it was the Microsoft SMTP server that came with IIS 5 and 6 and 7, I guess, but I had stopped by the time it was IIS 6. And I was on the MSDN communities and got so deep inside figuring out how this closed source thing worked. I mean, you want like a hard reverse engineering project. It's like you don't get to see the Munchkin JS library and sort of try to unminimize it and figure out what's going on inside it. Like you have nothing else to go on except timing things and like the way it interacts with the file system and Windows registry and all kinds of little things like that. But I became obsessed. Like I wanted to be the one who really understood it because I could kind of get the feeling, like to your point, that there were people providing generally correct answers, but trying to gloss over the fact that they really didn't understand why something worked or not. So that was kind of an automatic thing. That was probably the most immediate precedent for my Marketo and Munchkin thing was like, I need to know how this works because it feels like there's a missing store of knowledge even within Adobe than Marketo itself, like that's the tragedy to me is like, I felt like no one, and this has grown over the years, no one within the company that owns this product, currently at least, knows how it works. And that is the kind of thing that just irks me at some core level, I guess. So that's what's kind of kept me going. If I felt like, and I think this is kind of why I could never do the same thing for Salesforce, because over at Salesforce, you're like, okay, the engineers know how it works. We're just playing around in the community and trying to show off expertise or whatever, but it's like, you're never really going to you don't get that feeling like you're going to reveal something to the people that work there. But I think with Marketo, there's that sense of like, I can actually show the people who built it how it works. And not just because of institutional memory and stuff like that, or people departing, but because sometimes they don't really, and I say this with as much kindness as I can muster, they don't really understand how JavaScript and how browser stuff works. So they're not really front-end people. So you really kind of do have to say, the way your forms library is built struggles or does interesting things under these conditions. And it's not like you have anyone inside who's like, well, of course I knew that. It's more like, yeah, well, we kind of wanted to get it out the door. It is like a drive. It is that feeling of like, no one knows this. I'm not interested in doing it if I feel like someone knows it.
It's a mountain to be climbed that no one has climbed before.
Yeah.
I want to describe to you from an outsider's point of view, my perception when you came onto the scene, because at the time it felt like there were very few technical people, hardly anyone that I remember in the community. And it was really a lot of demand gen marketers or former demand gen marketers, some people maybe that self-identified as marketing ops. And so people would come up with solutions and things or maybe speculate. And it was always sort of impressive, people who seemed to have more knowledge of the inner workings, but they maybe didn't really know or didn't have the expertise. And then all of a sudden you emerged and it was like, oh, you're someone actually technical. And it was kind of like, a bunch of gophers trying to drive a car or something. And all of a sudden a Formula One racer comes out and is like, actually, here's how you do it. So to your point, I think it was a really valuable service. And you alluded about your security leanings and trying to hurt yourself of that. But I think that's part of the recipe from my point of view, is that nobody else really even understood the principles of what a DDoS vulnerability would be, or you know, like those things, like people just didn't think about that stuff. And then you, at least for me as an enterprise marketing operations consultant, really helped give me that vocabulary to then sort of absorb into my lexicon and take to clients and be like, well, actually, to me, all those components became part of the recipe of what you did that is unique.
Yeah, I think you're right that one thing I wanted to do is say, let's not guess. Also, that's another like painful thing when you see like a really well-intentioned person who nevertheless is just putting up a best guess. And it's like, I don't think it's that. Let's know as much as we can and like have a good faith effort to really, you know, bring together knowledge of databases and networks and just general enterprise architecture. And I give full credit to the people who didn't have that background, though, because they didn't have the, I mean, frankly, like years of experience, which you can't make that up out of nowhere. No. But they also had, and you know, still most of the people in MOPS are technically minded, or I guess maybe I could say like logically expert, but they don't have the hands-on experience because they didn't really come from that world. It's hard to extract yourself from the world where you're, you know, the jerk in the IT bullpen who doesn't want to do any work for marketing or sales. That was the thing that I was alluding to at the beginning, is like, I come from the original core of people who, when you said you were going to move to a cloud CRM, said, well, so much for getting any help from us. You do that. You say to the sales, you go to Salesforce, don't call us. Like, I was that guy. And now it's silly because I'm dealing with the IT people and I'm the person saying, you need to take this seriously. This is still part of the company. This is not, you can't actually ignore it. And a lot of that is coming not from pure cost, I think, which sometimes is valid, but it's coming from that still lingering, almost decades-old resentment from the IT team. Why are we paying for a thing I believe we could build in-house, that I believe we had a better version of before, you know, when I was young and strong and, you know, had the energy to do stuff. That's a funny interaction sometimes, because people will say, like, we could build this. What does this thing do? We could build it in-house. Like, I've had people say that about Marketo, which is just so insane to me. I'm like, how many developers are you going to put on this, you know, full time? But again, the flip side is I remember being that person, looking especially at the earliest cloud solutions and thinking, as a web developer, we could totally do this. Why are we paying for it? And, you know, those questions still swirl. Well, you're paying for it because you don't have enough time to have a full dev and QA staff working on it, and you wouldn't save any money on that anyway.
And build a workflow every time marketing wants one, and deploy a campaign. I mean, so speaking of these developers, whether it's sort of your classic IT developer at like a big company, or whether it's your cool, you know, Silicon Valley software engineer type, these are smart people, and yet many of them, let's say, have produced a ton of really bad work when it comes to MarTech, whether that's applications with horrible or unusable Marketo integrations that they built in-house, or you know, people doing unspeakable things. But these are people who had the same opportunity as you, let's say, to take apart Munchkin. They haven't stepped up to it, and it's not, as you've said to me in the past, that it's not that they're like bad developers or something, but like, what is it? Is it a lack of intellectual curiosity? Is it a feeling that it's beneath them? Why do traditional developers struggle when it comes to the MarTech stack?
I mean, I think there is a disparagement of marketing, and they don't think it's doing anything real. You know, if you somehow have told yourself that SMTP, which they don't understand, and landing pages, which, unless they're real front-end people, they don't understand, and all the database and workflow stuff and queuing stuff that a sophisticated MA has, you know, if you've told yourself that that's not real technology or it's unsophisticated technology, then you're going to keep sticking with it. Even if somebody shows you, like, I've had this moment, maybe you have too, where someone has been skeptical. They've taken that same view. Oh, what does this platform do? What, you know, it just looks like it's a landing page builder or something like that. And you show them on a good day, you show them some features, and you can actually blow somebody's mind. Like, I've had to give like some props to people who have evolved. Some people like didn't realize how sophisticated the Marketo to Salesforce sync is, for example. Although that's still, you know, firmly within the realm of sales and marketing, it's clearly a piece of engineering that's well done. And I've seen people like realize that they thought they knew how email works, and they don't. And that's one of those things where they talk to the IT team and say, can't we just send this all ourselves? And the IT team will be like, well, not really, because you can't really do that with, you know, Outlook, and like start to realized that there was a sophistication to the Marketo or HubSpot or anything, queuing and resource balancing, and even the multi-tenant architecture itself. Like, I've talked to people who don't really, because they're still like in-house developers, so they've never built a cloud app, so they don't think about what it would be like. Now, Marketo struggles at multi-tenancy, as we know, but nevertheless, the idea that, no, it's not just, they don't give you a machine, like that resource balancing across the different customers is something that in-house developers usually don't care about. They actually will have an app that could be overwhelmed by one business unit, but they don't really think about that as a concern because they're like, well, it's a fireable offense if you try to overwhelm the internal line of business apps. We're not going to worry about that. But the fact is, like, doing that and having a public-facing site, all the reputation management, email reputation management, the last internal IT people or developers in general understood anti-spam tactics and things like that was probably 15 years ago or more. I guess it's a long way of saying, to be optimistic about it, when those complexities are revealed to people, many of them have an epiphany and they realize that it actually is sophisticated technology. But to your original point, I think you're right that there's just immediate thought is, this is nothing, it's simple. Why do we even need it? Just gets like caught up in that.
The light bulb that just went off to me with what you were saying is that through, like what I mentioned in the beginning, like, we're going to free you from dependence on IT and you can do your own thing. And then we did our own thing for a while. And then all of a sudden, IT forgot a lot of that knowledge that they used to have to be responsible for, perhaps. And also, like you said, that there is a kind of primacy of back-end developers over front-end developers. Like, back-end is perceived as more sophisticated, requires more skill and expertise. And yet, you can, write really crazy things in Python, but maybe you don't know how to debug a web script or figure out why a form isn't submitting properly.
Exactly. I mean, you spend your time disparaging JavaScript and saying it's a joke language. That's the most ubiquitous language. It is the language of the web. There are confusing things about JS, but it sure as heck is not easy to learn. And I think a lot of those people are just running away from how hard it is. They just assume, especially now, you were going to ask about like AI stuff. They always think, oh, well, I can just run it through ChatGPT to translate my Python. But you can't, because there's no client Python that you could write that would, there's no, I think it's great. It's almost like, it's brilliant because it's a little bit of job security too, because if you don't have some JS skills to start with, there's like nothing you can translate, automatically to that world. You have to understand all of these arcane, if you read like the ECMAScript standard, where I'm always going to like prove why things don't work or whatever, the ECMAScript /JavaScript standard, or like, HTML5, like official W3C standards, they're really hard to read. Like, you might wave your hands and be like, oh, I don't need to know that, it's dumb. But I mean, it just doesn't quite work. Like, it's not dumb. It's actually arcane and hard and not as satisfying as Python. If you're doing like, quant stuff in Python or, any kind of back-end work, you're probably going to get more immediate satisfaction out of that. But for me, coding is never about immediate gratification. For me, I think that's one of the things that makes people scared, like you said about, scared of troubleshooting a form. Like, somebody opens a thread on Marketo Nation, and I'm always like, okay, I know I'm going to figure out how this works. I'm not going to let this just sit there, or, why the form is breaking. But I'm also like, this could take 2 to 3 hours, and sometimes it does, just running it through a proxy server, simulating the conditions that might have led to a form sometimes not submitting and sometimes submitting, that those anomalous or seemingly random behaviors are some of the hardest things. You just don't really get that if you're a back-end developer. You don't have, I don't want to generalize there. I mean, you could introduce bugs that create what seems to be anomalous behavior, but there's nothing to compare to the weirdness of web development, like to the whole, like, I think it's randomly failing to submit the form, but then I'm always like, there's no such thing as randomness. It has something to do with network conditions.
The truth is out there.
Figure out what it is, But I talk to people who are intrigued by my seeming specialty as a MarTech developer, and some of them are currently developers, and I will say, well, one of the first things you need to do is get your feet wet again in that thing you probably ran away from a few years ago or 5 years ago or in school or whatever, that thing you think is elementary. You can't skip the knowing how web browsers work part of web development. And that's another thing. I mean, doing this stuff for a long time, I was there. I wasn't good at it. I sucked at it, but I was there. And in fact, I was scared because it was like early JavaScript. It was like too impenetrable to me. when I was, doing security stuff, there were also like web developers out there. I know this guy, he'll never hear this, Vince Allen, one of the greatest JavaScript developers of early JavaScript that I've ever met. Like insane. I can't even, the things that he could do, we worked for a startup together. I was the back-end database guy or chief technology guy, whatever it was, short-lived startup. He was the front-end guy. He was way overqualified because the app didn't really need the skills he had in what we used to call, DHTML or dynamic interactions and things like that. So good. And I was like horrified at the idea of how far he was from me, or how far he was even from most people building web pages at the time. I think he went on to work for Google internally. He might have even retired by now or something like that. But there was that period where you really had to know what you're doing to push early JS to its limits, but knowing there were people who were masters is really important. And then you had the whole period of frameworks and that's another thing, people not really learning JS happened 10, 15 years ago. They would learn jQuery or whatever. And so because they never really learned it, and then you plop them into something where it's like, well, Marketo forms do somewhat unfortunately use jQuery under the hood, but you're not going to get away with just understanding the core idea of building a jQuery and Bootstrap powered site. Like, you have to get real JS. Like I said, again, the idea of, those race conditions, the timing issues, weird cross-origin security things. You just knowing jQuery doesn't help you figure them out. And that's a lot of what I do, because it's this form, we're not getting leads because this form doesn't submit. It doesn't matter how good you are at jQuery. It's unlikely that you're going to be troubleshooting that at a code level. You're troubleshooting at a network level and getting deep into browser internals.
Reflecting back on your comment about being the person who will take 3 hours to answer some obscure question. On the one level, you're like, you have a good billable rate. Why would you invest that amount of time, which represents money, into something obscure? And maybe who else will ever have that exact question? And yet, to me, it's because you have figured out those things that no one else has figured out, that you're my phone a friend. Or even to this day, I shared in some community that we're both in, I was having some trouble with an accented character not rendering properly. And I'm like, something in my brain, I had my Sanford sense go off, and I'm like, I think he's talked about this. I do my little site search of your site, and there it is, was the answer. And so it's like, it doesn't matter until it matters, but then it really does matter. And if no one else has figured that out before, then you're screwed. You have nothing. I mean, it's really important.
It's like I will go maybe forever, but sometimes for years before using one of my discoveries for billable work. Like you said, in the meantime, I can help other people out like you with it. But what I don't want to be in the situation where there's an emergency and I need to spend those 3 hours on my own client's work. So it's almost like and perhaps unwise for my time management, but I'm like, I'd rather spend 3 hours now on the chance that I have something to have in my pocket for 2 years from now, or hopefully shorter, when a client has that question. Okay, I can only bill for an hour because I'm not going to lie and say it took me the 3 hours then, but at least I don't have the panic that I would have when I know that my client's boss is breathing down their neck. I know that the form doesn't work. I know about the consequences. It may be unwise, frankly. I'm not a practical person. I mean, if you only knew, the amount of time that I spent for things that have no meaning at all. But yeah, if I have any defense at all, which is rare, if I have any defense, it's that someday someone will ask me to do it, and they are my client, and I get to give them the immediate answer. What I really want, I would love to be in an advisory position. Knowing this stuff is key to product development. But this is a frustrating thing about the role that a MarTech developer plays for a client. I'm taking the load off the internal product team, right? Like sometimes someone was contacting me yesterday. It's a flourishing, well-funded startup, whatever. The head of product said, we can't ask their web devs to do anything for marketing anymore. So I'm going to ask you because I know you know how to do it. And I was like, great. But I also had that kind of sinking feeling of okay, now that's yet another isolation point. I will never know what the product team is doing and whether the product team could make use of deep knowledge that is relevant to any web app. And I feel like I do have a lot of that knowledge, whether it be in coding knowledge or, that deep browser timing knowledge and so on, that a lot of commercial web apps suffer from not having a person like that on the team. But that's the way it is. I'm there to take the load off that team, not to, confer with that team about issues of the same type that their main site might have. But it is what it is, I guess. That's another. Sometimes it's like, doing a marketing thing on never mind the app part of it, but the corporate site, the brochure site, if you will. I have to kind of hold my tongue a lot, because I'm like, it probably would be good if you didn't have a race condition for your other stuff, or you didn't have, it would be good if you weren't loading 100 different remote services on this page. That's not my business. My business is make sure the embedded Marketo form works. And that's
the tough part of any consulting, where you got me like, don't look over there. Don't look over there.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's
look straight
exactly.
ahead.
Well, you've been in this situation, when you're building out a campaign and you look at the email content and you go, oh God, that's so ugly, but you can't say it because it's not, or even like a new logo, you're like, oh, say nothing. So
this touches on a question that I wanted to ask, and to some degree it was a motivator for me to leave consulting, at least leave it for now, and go back in-house, which was in the role of being a technologist that supports marketers. You're always coming in downstream of strategy. Like there's always a strategy and a goal and a campaign goal. Yeah. And sometimes, I guess I believe in marketing, and you mentioned earlier you believe in marketing and its value. It's not that we're saying marketing is not good, but there is a lot of bad marketing, or there's campaign ideas that don't work, or there's things that don't matter. And so you can architect very elegant technical solutions, but you're building a cannon, but it's being aimed at the wrong target, or it's never going to hit. And how do you feel about that, just in general?
I mean, you try to sometimes nudge people. It depends on the relationship with the client. Sometimes you can say, well, I've worked in this area, or I've actually done marketing myself, and kind of bring that in. But yeah, it's painful because it's not what you're being retained to do. And here's another thing the outside world doesn't understand. The difference between marketers and marketing operations people. I mean, you could nab 10,000 people off the street, and one of them might understand the difference just based on their experience, right? So
that's true.
But I think it's almost a curse of being an ops person with a good design eye, or at least non-zero design eye, or campaign planning, or just audience understanding, persona. But I feel we're just going to have to shut up. I could think of countless times where I've talked to a client and I'm like, well, I don't know the industry well, or as well as they do, but I'm still like, this offer for these people, this is non-identifiable information, offering like a $10 Amazon gift card is one example. It's just one of a million examples, but it's another idea where I'm like thinking about the persona, the person. Why is it that who needs the $10 card? I know you're B2B. Every one of your decision makers is make mid, six figures. What? Not saying it doesn't. Maybe they know better than I do, but that would just be, again, that was a very superficial example. But it's the kind of thing where I have to go, today we're working on the $10 Amazon gift card for CEOs campaign. All right, let's.
The thing that's going to push them over the edge.
Right, exactly. It's like review. It's also like it's the $10 Amazon gift card for CEOs if they provide a review on one of the. I'm like, okay. Let's figure out how we can get the campaign timing to work, because I can't do anything. But what do you think about that? I mean, like, is there any room for expansion into that world, or are we just doomed to shut up? And
I mean, I guess for me, that was a motivation to return to an in-house role where ostensibly you have some input on strategy and you're having that discussion about what should we do versus just how do we do it? Like, should we build this bridge over there versus how do we cross this span?
Right.
I think it's important to have both. And yeah, this is one of the things I wrestle with because, there's people that are like, we need to get over there. And then there's the people that say, let's do it. And there's a division of labor there. And it works for a reason, because if you have, the person that's hitting rocks with a pick hammer every 5 seconds being like, wait a second, is this the right thing? Like, things become unworkable. So there's roles and responsibilities for some reason. At the same time, maybe I just felt I needed to go outside that for a bit, which results in being less technically oriented. Like, I'm more distant from some of the technical things than I was, not irreparably so. But yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, I mean, often it's also like you can feel the political, even if you could say something, you don't want to, because you don't want to be blamed for making a suggestion when it's not your role too. Like, sometimes I have found that a client might be genuinely receptive to your suggestion and even skeptical in their own right about things, that have been handed down to them from marketing. But the moment you enter into that relationship with them, you might get the feeling that they're going to say, well, Sandy agreed about this, and all of a sudden you're implicated in making the suggestion that everybody else from a strategy standpoint rejected or something like that.
To me, the best form of marketing is demonstrating expertise in public and building trust. If I need a MarTech developer, you're the only person I'm going to reach out to because you care 100 times more than any other person, and you demonstrate it on a weekly, if not daily basis, like more than anybody else.
I had an interesting situation like this with a client recently that is not directly related to marketing. I was working with a party who was working for their client. And you might have seen me post about this on Mops Pro's Slack channel. I did a tiny one-line vent about it because I thought it was so silly, but yet disturbing and silly. The client had said that the Marketo Lead ID is PII and that it can't be included in, it wasn't actually in URLs. It was actually for internal purposes. They couldn't key things off the Marketo Lead ID. I found myself in one of those situations where I couldn't hold my tongue because it wasn't really a marketing question. It was a privacy strategy thing. I'm not a specialist in privacy, but something when it just sounds completely preposterous and wrong and you can't say nothing, So, and I still haven't gotten a satisfactory answer. I said they needed some massive yet insufficient workaround because their client had told them that the Marketo Lead ID is PII. And I was like, okay, we can do this. Maybe you do this. It's never going to be it doesn't make any sense. And I kept saying, again, to repeat, I really have never heard anybody say anything like that in my entire career.
Because it's a system-assigned ID.
Right, a randomly generated. Oh, they said, okay, to be clear, they said the same thing about the Marketo unique code. So it's not, you might be able to, wouldn't buy it, but you might be able to make the argument that the auto-incrementing numeric lead ID has some sort of predictability to it. In fact, one of my clients once made a good point about that you can predict the sequence of lead IDs, so whatever. It's still the same as PII, but it's like a security thing more than a privacy thing by any means. But the client applied the same fractured logic, in my opinion, to the Marketo unique code, a guaranteed unique alphanumeric sequence that has no meaning outside of Marketo. And that's just hard to, once you hear things like that, actually expand it to a whole realm of what other poor decisions is somebody making. So maybe it shut me up more because I was like, okay, if they're that wrong, I'm not going to stop talking about other things. But I thought it was a good example of something crossing the line where I couldn't be quiet about it, even though it's very far from the direct responsibility that I had in the project. And I think that you, in your current role, I would imagine you're in the room where people are saying things like that, and Justin can raise his hand and say, that sounds nonsensical, you guys. But you can't do that as a consultant because it's you kind of just, okay.
I mean, there's a flip side to that because sometimes I notice this, not a commentary on my current job, but when I first left my in-house role to go to consulting, there is a prestige on the flip side that comes with they're a consultant. So there's this halo, that surrounds the consultant in some scenarios that you don't have when you're in-house. But I think at a company of my stage, the questions are a lot more go-to-market strategy than the thorniness of PI. Not that we don't care about PII, but I think it's maybe only in a massive enterprise sometimes where you have the luxury. Sometimes it can become almost a navel-gazing exercise, for lack of a better word. I want to ask you, we both have a long history with Marketo and have based our careers in various ways on that platform. What's baked into the question is that there's obviously a lot to like about Marketo. We appreciate it and all that. But what's your perspective on the platform? Are the glory days behind it? We talk about the things that are the best about it, and it's still the Smart campaign, the Salesforce integration, things that are really from the early days when it had a lot of vigor and energy as a product company. And it's hard to think of innovations that come close to that in recent times. So I don't want to go down too far the path of just venting against Marketo, but what's your product outlook and what do you think they need to do to remain relevant as a platform?
We were speaking about these add-ons like integration with Adobe Connect webinars and the seeming struggle of getting live chat as a replacement for Drift and so on. If I were in charge, I would shut down anything that seems like it's trying to be a lookalike for a pale imitation of something. I think in both of those cases is a customer retention concept, right? They're not charging more for those, which is both to their credit and also makes it seem even more bizarre because the idea is we're going to use this instead of Drift, and so we're going to save all the money on Drift, except it's also nowhere near as good as Drift, so that's never going to happen.
It doesn't do live chat. It doesn't do... Yeah, I agree. So actually, let's rebuild Marketo. Like we'll build their roadmap on paper for free. They can just take it and use it.
Right.
So we kill the chat. We kill the Adobe Connect thing, whatever that is. So get rid of that.
Yeah, what would we build? What would we build in its stead? What is the thing that isn't trying to keep up with the Joneses in a feeble way, but is actually, long desired?
That to me is like the critical thing, right? It's the whole idea of getting ahead of the market and where it's going and understanding the needs, the Steve Jobs-esque quality of understanding the thing that people could want before it even existed. I don't know if there's anybody there that is thinking about the customer that hard. And it comes back to the question of building technical solutions for things that don't actually work that well. A lot of it's like, does anyone care about what is effective marketing and what actually is revenue producing, and then trying to build solutions that make that easier and more effective? I think there are tools out there that really work well, like the meeting booking link things where you can book a meeting on a website. To me, that's a real customer convenience. It's beneficial. It takes less time. It's removing friction from the sales process. It's a tool that solves a legitimate customer problem. And I wonder, is there any new features coming out that actually solve new customer problems? There's all the, this thing is inefficient. Could we clone flow steps or save smart campaign templates? Little things, that all the convenience features that people ask for that they never make it to production because there's what incremental revenue is associated with that feature aside from customer happiness. There's all that category of stuff. And then there's the big innovations, which are really hard to think of. And it seems that it's usually smaller companies with dynamic founders who care about the problem and obsess about it, come up with those solutions. I don't necessarily know what they are, but I haven't seen those things coming out from any of the big players in marketing automation. This isn't just a Marketo thing.
Here's a thing that we know from AWS. I mean, Amazon's obviously been around for a long time, but that idea that at Amazon internally, they use their own APIs. So they can't go around the APIs and avoid discovering the bugs in the APIs. I think that, Marketo and now Adobe has never made that commitment. They've never decided we're going to have a flexible, full-featured API that we are going to dog food for our own interface, which would, of course, allow you to create, here's a thing. Okay, I'm going to interrupt myself because I do think this is something that it is absurd that they have not put this in the pipeline. And it's related directly to the idea of having a public Marketo UI API or an SDK for building visual add-ons to the Marketo UI.
Right.
That is, I've gone from defending it and saying it's not their business, they never wanted to do that, to kind of thinking it's shocking after all these years. And to get back to our whole discussion of front-end developers, that an interested front-end developer, one who is motivated, can't even do it if they want to. They cannot say, I am going to spend time customizing my organization's UI. You can do it in Salesforce. You can't do it in Marketo.
So not just a self-service flow step, but really like skinning and even layout and stuff like that.
Well, I think SSFS is actually a way of avoiding these better technologies. I mean, SSFS is creating an API that others can consume, but it's low effort for Marketo themselves. Actually rewriting, and we know how hard this is.
Like a Visualforce page, the equivalent of a Visualforce.
Exactly. With a move from Classic to the Aura Lightning components in Salesforce was a major undertaking for Salesforce. I cannot imagine how many hours, pure expenses they had to get to that point. And it's still not the greatest thing I've ever seen, but it does seem like Adobe is uninterested in that level of customizability and extensibility. It's not just it's extensibility. It's the ability for someone to say, okay, I want to create a new reporting all with my code, but consuming the same backend data, and I want it to appear as a tab within the Marketo UI.
It makes Marketo more of a platform, right? And less of that's just a point tool of execution, and it generates some first-party data, which I'm going to take out and do that work somewhere else.
But I just want to caution, so I don't sound crazy as a front-end person, and I know the reputation of projects like that. Rewriting from scratch, which is what this would entail, even if it's only the front end, it's one of the things that the greatest, the legendary programmers dedicate chapters of their horror, books of horror to decisions, rewrite things from scratch, which is fascinating because it means that this notion, rewrite from scratch, is dismissed by the greatest developers in the world. It implies that a given product in its current general iteration cannot be rewritten in place. It has to be rewritten there has to be a substantive evolution to what constitutes a new app in order to make such an effort worthwhile and to not get slapped by the reality and the disasters that seemingly always follow such a decision. So I get it, but it's such a funny thing to know that it's like, if you say rewrite from scratch, you'll get made fun of by, experienced graybeard devs, as they say.
So you have to rebuild the car like one piece at a time until you get a new car. You can't just build a new car.
Well, you can modular, or you can say it's a new app, but the idea is you don't try to rewrite the current functionality in another language or with another framework or in another scenario. And you might say .next can be totally different, and that's Marketo tried that with Sky, and that's
I was just going to go to Sky. That was the next
right. But they never really ripped it all out. So,
but why Sky? I think a lot of people wonder why Sky failed.
Right.
Like, why did they back away and leave us with this like Franken UI that it seems like it will never be fully transitioned? It's the weirdest thing. Like, maybe Sky was imperfect, really weird, it had issues, but there was a significant investment. There was it was going somewhere, it seemed. And I don't think the reactions were terrible to it in the community. And yet they backed away somehow, maybe for adoption reasons. And they're like, let's do this in between and you can toggle, but we're going to update like parts of the UI at a time. And now I've gotten used to it, but if you back away, it's a horrifying thought to have a UI like that, for an app.
It was I
can't think of another app that looks that way.
I think that, look, I don't have any inside information, so that's that. But they decided to get away from the XJS framework they're currently using and try to use another framework at the same time against the same API. I think that's part of it. They didn't want to completely rewrite. And again, that sounds like I'm saying it's bad to completely rewrite, but they didn't want to do a vNext, right? They wanted to do the Sky on the current, when I say it's like the API for the front end. That is to say, the public API that isn't documented but allows for fetching things like, smart lists and flow steps and all the stuff that happens. I think they wanted to keep that same API but consume it using a different front-end framework. And that falls into the category of never do that. That's, I think, the most experienced developers and product people would say, no, you're going to have to, you're doing Marketo V2. You cannot do UI V2 on top of Marketo V1. You have to do a full evolution. And I don't know why they didn't do that. I've seen that succeed. MailerLite, small consumer player mostly, they've got MailerLite V1 and MailerLite V2, and there are substantive differences. But they obviously have a team that I think it's, privately held small team of probably more loyal people and less distraction and whatever. And but that's super weird. I feel like if I had to put something on the roadmap, it would be the customizable UI. It would be the ability to say you can now build directly into the UI. That's the kind of thing where you could get your Salesforce Lightning developer interested. That's where you get a front-end person to go, hey, this is actually cool. I can plug into the menus. I can bring this data in and visualize it in different ways. Another thing I would do if I were in charge of product is start looking at whole database metrics. And you and I worked on this together
when we did the time series?
The time series thing, right.
Yeah, we did that.
The fact that we did do that together. For the listeners, this was a way of pulling a database into an external time series database through which we could do things that seem simple, like sorting the people in the database by their level of, let's call it, web engagement. So we could say that they were in the 4 quartiles. You could say this person is in the top quartile of web engagement, or you could say this person is in, the 3rd quartile of email clicks or whatever. It's not difficult to do in a modern database, even one that is not specifically designed for time series data. The one that you and I use, Justin, is obviously a time series database, but you can now do it in Postgres and in, I think to some degree, in MariaDB, which is like MySQL, which Marketo uses. But for whatever reason, they never thought, hey, maybe somebody wants to see the database, see the relationships between people within the Marketo database. To me, it's like the lowest hanging fruit. If I had all the Marketo data in a modern Postgres 11 plus or whatever version it would have to be, if I had all that stuff and I wanted to write a cool query that would blow somebody's mind for a new evolution of Marketo, that's what I would do. I would do split by quintile, basically letting the leads in your database interrogate each other as to which ones are higher or lower value. There's some degree, I think, that they do that with like the heat ratings and
the sales
and relative scoring,
scores, urgency and relative score.
But it's not. But it's like it's opaque. It doesn't need to be opaque. You should. I mean, that's kind of needless. It doesn't need to be magic, kind of fake AI, right? You should be able to run those queries, I think, directly. Split the database by any number of time-based, contributions to the value of a person. But I don't know what stops them from doing that, because here I am quite sure their back end supports it. They just never kind of think, well, like, we don't want to give another dashboard. We'll say you can pull the data out yourself. And they do. Actually, you know about the activity stream feature? I haven't used it.
No. What is it?
The activity stream feature, which is supposedly free, lets you syndicate the rows of the activity log in near real time to a web service of your choosing.
So this is like an API feature?
Yeah, but the cool thing is it's outbound. So it's like a streaming API where you give it an endpoint and it will send the activity log lines to that endpoint. I mean, it's asynchronous, surely, but it's like roughly as they come in. They get relayed to an external endpoint. This is the kind of thing
I just got the notes up here, the developer notes.
You can kind of see as a database architect, I know that those features like change data capture and row-based replication and that kind of thing are all part of modern databases. So it seems like it was something that makes sense for them to have introduced. The thing is, it still requires that you have in-house people and you build a service that can receive, it's the furthest thing you can get from a new dashboard. It gives you the building blocks to build real-time dashboards in outside, in third-party utilities by streaming the data to them. But it contains nothing else except the raw log lines. So it's like...
This is a good feature. I'm just looking through the notes. This is a good feature. I clearly haven't been following closely enough.
No, I mean, look, I haven't had it enabled in any of my instances, so I'm as...
This just come out?
6 months ago, maybe.
Okay. Well, I missed it in the release.
I'm gonna try it, yes. I mean,
this is really... Because, like it says, it solves a lot of problems where you're constantly auditing and, or polling, rather, for changes and the backlog that creates and, the challenge with real-time triggering. So my top two, for me at least... There's always the limitations that you encounter in the raw workflow capabilities. Like, you can't quite manipulate data that way. If I think of Marketo, which to me is like Marketo, but split apart into 12 dimensions, because you can work across multiple systems, and also the data pill capability in recipes, your ability to pull in data from a previous step, interrogate it, use formulas to manipulate it in various ways. Kind of like what Munchkins or
Munchkins,
Munchkins, that very short-lived and obscure thing where you could, I guess, kind of what FlowBoost tries to do, but inside of Marketo, to me, again, is like a very obvious thing to do. The ability to better manage race conditions. I think, like a lot of the gray hair you get in Marketo, if you care about doing your job well, is how do I make sure that I'm not tripping over myself? And there's a lot of different ways to do that and a lot of different hacks and things, but the kind of feeling that you can never fully have the system under control. And maybe this is an impossibility, you tell me as a developer, to like, that you always have this multiple layers of the database and things committing at various times, so you can never fully have perfect control. But then the ability to handle that in some more elegant way than like doing your best, but always feeling that there's an outside chance that something might trip over itself.
I mean, I do think it's kind of an unsolvable, even though it's not like a distributed system, where distributed systems have even increased impossibility of getting of having a predictable settled state at any one point in time. But I think the Marketo design philosophy seems to be to dumb things down and not expose the reality of what's happening under the hood to the end user. And I think that just knowing that, I mean, maybe this is crazy. I don't know if any commercial platform has ever done this, but having visibility in database changes have yet to be committed. Imagine a super awesome spy view where you could see, as leaving aside the overhead of providing this view, let's leave that aside, but like where you could see in real time as things are written to the database or databases as databases. Don't pretend they're not databases, right? And I caution people about, like, I say don't call the custom object a custom object table. So I'm kind of a hypocrite here. Like, I'm saying, like, don't call it a table. We don't know how it's implemented. It could be 4 tables. It could be, joined together relationally, whatever it could be. But surely there is a happy medium between this dumbed down, I don't really know what's happening under the hood, I just have to guess, based on the fact that it's got a database with, like, there's going to be a row level lock, right? Like, that's the kind of thing you and I know about for years now. It's like, it's a SQL database. So we know only one row is being updated at one time. We know that if two flow steps try to update the same row, one of them has to go first and the other one has to go second, even if they're updating the same, or especially if they're updating the same field. You cannot specify the order of those updates. I don't know what kind of visualization you could have of that, but it just seems like there's been a concerted effort to like conceal these essential database realities. I think you put it really well when you said you never really feel like you know what's going on with the Marketo. Like you don't. I feel, and less of a Salesforce person, but I feel more secure about what's happening, the state of a Salesforce org at point N in time than I do about Marketo. Like what's really happening, what's in a wait step, what's waiting to commit, what's about to be overwritten, right? Like what looks a certain way right now, but when I refresh, it's going to look different. There is that uncertainty.
There's no debug log. All right, so you give marketers these developer tools, but it's not like a MailChimp where it's just like, here's a glossy interface and you have these little boxes that you can play with, but you're kind of, everything else is locked down. It does actually give you a tool set, and I think that's why I love Marketo, why lots of people love Marketo. It's like, whoa, like I'm not a developer, but I can do developer-esque things with this platform. But then you're like, whoa, actually developer-esque things are hard because I have enough rope to hang myself with and I can screw things up. And it's like, okay, I'm going to get better. And then I'm going to learn from folks like you who really understand developer principles. So things like dry, not repeating yourself, centralizing things, or order of operations concerns, or whatever, all those kind of things that I've picked up. But then at the end of the day, it only goes so far. So that you don't have like the full control that maybe I presume one does in a code application where you're really writing things yourself. And so I guess that's it. It's like, maybe it's unrealistic to think that you really could ever do that, like have your cake and eat it too. It's like, I can go so far, but no further within this interface.
I think that the design principle of make it seem like it's a technical person's platform, which it is. To do it well, you have to have technical gifts. There's no doubt. I think that a person who can build a great instance like you, others of your caliber could also be great developers if you wanted to be bored out of your skulls.
In a separate timeline.
Yeah, and I think there's a sense that it doesn't satisfy anybody completely. If you're not very skilled or don't have those gifts, you're going to be overwhelmed and basically have a continuous anxiety. I mean, it's a brilliant platform because it kind of sells itself based on its technical flexibility. If you don't disclose how much consulting help you might need after you buy it, it seems like the solution to really any B2B marketing needs.
Let's close with the buzzy question, which is around AI. And of all the people that I personally have a chance of interacting with on a semi-regular basis, you're probably the person that maybe best would understand what actually might be happening with AI, which has become just horribly hyped, and everything has those two letters attached to it. Marketo's tried to use what was formerly called machine learning a number of times, I think. Mostly it seemed unsuccessfully, like predict your audience or deliver the right content to the right time. Maybe those capabilities are more achievable now in a meaningful way with the tools we have today, the technology we have today. But I guess even beyond Marketo, just in the broader realm of MarTech, is this hype to you? Is this a real thing that is going to have an impact on our discipline? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm not one of these, scoffers who's like, oh, it's just one big database. It's just the most powerful database ever created. Speaking of LLMs, and in general, I'm intimidated by and impressed by a lot of it. But from a marketing, not so much marketing ops standpoint, the first dread I got wasn't about what I do for a living or what you do, but the idea that people are like, I'm going to ask ChatGPT to write my taglines, to write my content for my page based on, and I'm like, and people are obviously doing that by the thousand, taking a critical eye on the output of ChatGPT and others. From a marketing copy standpoint, it's like I have not seen evidence that it's better, faster, or impressive than a copywriter would be. But the idea is to put copywriters out of business. It's the same thing that's happened in many industries. It's not that the technology is actually better than the people. That I think we need to get past the fallacy that it's better than people. But what it could in theory be is way cheaper than people, and from
and good enough
business standpoint, that's all that matters. To me, it's like, don't try to sell me on AI written documentation being better than handwritten documentation. You can sell me on it being faster and almost right in certain cases, but what concerns me, even from the standpoint of documentation, where you kind of do think that more is better, that's like with documentation, the less is more concept is completely false. Absolutely not true. I am firmly opposed to that. You know that I hate when things are dumbed down. The idea of expanding product documentation via AI is fascinating to me because it sounds like super awesome, great net win. But when something's wrong in the docs, the load on people for doing that thing wrong might actually on net, be negative. So it's hard to say. Like the Marketo product docs have errors in them that an AI-based doc generator couldn't make. So that's something where I have to concede. You know what? If those docs were written by ChatGPT, it couldn't make certain. I'm not saying it couldn't make new errors, but it couldn't make the errors like there's I don't know if you've noticed this in the product docs, like there are curly quotes in the code samples that have to be straight quotes or it's going to be a fatal error. There are like errors in the MIME type structure for the Marketo REST API docs that could never happen with an AI, documentation library. But would it make other mistakes and assumptions that would then become the stuff of support tickets and confusion and the need to have it gone over by someone? And you know how technical documentation is. There's maybe one person in the world who knows whether something is true or not. From my perspective, like MarTech development, like front end stuff, I would love to know that some of the stuff that I've written on my blog and put out there in the world ends up being digested by ChatGPT and becomes part of the corpus of things that other people are learning from because it's open source anyway. And I hope that people are able to use other people's work and get good code out of it. That's the kind of advantage of all the time that I spend diving into the underpinnings, the internals of Marketo stuff or just browser stuff in general. If you publish that and it becomes part of ChatGPT's learning, I think that's great because it has more of a payoff. That sounds maybe a little bit too rosy, but in a way it has more payoff to spend 3 hours on something and know that people will be able to learn from that in their own code bases as opposed to having to search for you and find it on your blog. That's a positive. How about you?
Yeah, I'm broadly aligned with your point of view. The way I've started to think about AI a little bit is like, I'm a Star Trek fan. Probably not familiar with the computer on a Star Trek ship.
Sure.
Where you're like, computer, create for me a model of XYZ and then do this. So it's just like you're giving it prompts. It's performing computation and it's producing an output, which is very convenient. And so I think with things like that, where it's providing convenience and allowing you to interact with information and do things with it and model things in some kind of virtual space that would otherwise be hard to do, or summarizing things for you, or like, distilling action items from a call, whatever. Totally. The idea that it will ever produce marketing copy or content or messaging that is useful seems really hard to imagine. A, because all the stuff I've seen it do is just like really basic and uninteresting, and B, because it's guaranteed to be average. It's always taking the average of the average of the average of a trillion data points. And so does evolution just stop there? Because it's not going to, it doesn't have that spark of intuition or understanding of human nature that's going to say like, here's like a really funny video. Is AI going to be capable of that sort of creativity? I just doubt it. So the idea of using it to generate content to me seems contradictory on the surface. Who knows whether I'll be right.
I tend to agree. I mean, I do follow a couple of very funny comedians. They're really more like written comedians, like, punchline Twitter comedians who show the futility of ChatGPT at understanding jokes sometimes. And it's very, like, it definitely supports your concept. They'll feed it an ancient vaudeville joke and ask it to explain the joke, and it just hallucinates a completely wrong reason that it's supposed to be funny.
Oh, but I think to cap that point, I think humor is the perfect example of like something so basic that a child of 2 or 3 can understand a joke and laugh, and yet that the most sophisticated computer models can't properly explain, which to some extent is a reassuring notion that there are some things that always will remain sort of beyond that reach. I think we do have to wrap, but this conversation is everything I hoped it would be, in the sense of just
that was great. I could do this all the time.
The lateral thinking, the various topics that we covered, and I'm glad to be able to share that with the world first and foremost. Second, appreciate you and all that you give to the community, and that you helped me with personally, being my phone a friend more times than I can count, and sharing your knowledge so freely. So thank you, Sandy.
Well, you taught me originally the stuff that made me able to pretend to understand Marketo from the back end. So I think you did.
A fraction of
way back. But no, it's really great to be on. think it's my first official podcast, so that's something. If I ever start one of my own, I will ask about your tech stack once you get it figured out here.
Hey everyone, I want to invite you over to the RevOps FM Substack community, where you can sign up to get rough transcripts, show notes, longer form articles, and other bonus content. Just head over to revops.fm/subscribe to get free access. I'd also love to know what you thought of the episode and to hear suggestions for topics you want to learn about. Feel free to leave a comment on Substack or send me an email at justin@revops.fm. Thanks for listening.